Good evening or good morning to everybody. It's a great pleasure to have so many here to listen to Barry Eichengreen and Ricardo Reis. And this is a webinar organized by the Institute of Global Affairs at the LSE, at the LSE School of Public Policy. We are very honored to have Barry. I know that he has given already one webinar this morning because I was on it myself. So we have he's already warmed up with and he's going to talk on the three horsemen: pandemic, war, and depression in the 20th century. So I don't think for this audience I need to introduce Barry very extensively, but Barry, of course, is an economic historian. But if you think that economic historians don't get involved in today's issue, Barry is very different from that, and he someone who very much takes his history seriously, but looks at what implications are for today. And I think that's very much what he's going to do today. Of course, Barry is a professor at the University of Berkeley. He's written extensively on of course, economic history, international economics, one of the most prolific and productive economists around. So we are greatly honored to have you here. And of course, we have our own Ricardo Reis, who's professor here at the London School of Economics and a very dear and very active, productive colleague of mine here at LSE. So I don't want to use more time of yours, Barry, so please go ahead and so I ask people to mute if you're not speaking, and please, if you can, then we will, after the speech by Barry and the comments by Ricardo, we will let people come in, so you can then use both your the raise your hand function, or you can tell us through the chat function. So please, Barry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eric. It's good to be with you this morning. I was supposed to talk at the LSE on March 25th, so my appearance there has been somewhat delayed. I was going to say this is second best substitute for physically being there, but now I see how many old friends are on the call. Maybe this is better. Indeed. So I've been asked to offer some economic historians' reflections on what we're going through at the moment. I think my starting point is the observation that economic historians tend to be bombarded with questions about parallels whenever we go through a crisis like this. So I'm experiencing deja vu of what I went through in 2008. I think that phenomenon is easy enough to understand. Human beings, uniquely among species, instinctively reason by way of analogy, by drawing parallels. I'm told by cognitive scientists that chimpanzees can be taught modes of cognition that resemble analogical reasoning, but only with great difficulty. It's only human beings, children already at a young age, that begin to reason analogically. And history, of course, is a rich source of analogies. When the global financial crisis struck, everybody immediately began asking, how does this crisis compare with the Great Depression? And I eventually wrote a book that explored that comparison. When COVID-19 hit, the economic historians among us were immediately asked, how does this pandemic compare with the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919? Or how does the rise in unemployment now compare with the rise of unemployment after 1929? Or how does the mobilization of resources to fight the pandemic today compare with the mobilization of resources during World War II? I'm reminded that both Donald Trump and Boris Johnson have referred to themselves as wartime leaders. So you will have noticed the pattern that these questions about historical analogies and precedents tend to be associated with crises. Crises, of course, are when there's no time for systematic deductive reasoning, where deductive reasoning means deducing conclusions by feeding assumptions and data into a model, which in turn presupposes the ability that you have the time to build and solve the model. So it's precisely in crises when we lack that time that policymakers tend to resort to historical analogies for decision-making rules of thumb. Foreign policy specialists have emphasized and analyzed this point at length, how President Harry Truman, when deciding to intervene in Korea, based his decision-making on the analogy with World War I, how John F. Kennedy, when deciding how to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis, leaned on the Munich analogy, how George W. Bush, when deciding how to respond to 9/11, was influenced by the Pearl Harbor analogy. Or to pick an example closer to home, there's the case of President Gerald Ford and his advisors when deciding how to respond to an outbreak of swine flu in 1976. They based their reasoning on the analogy with the 1918 Spanish influenza, which killed more than 50 million people globally. It turned out that swine flu was less contagious and less deadly, but anticipating a public health emergency akin to the Spanish flu, the Ford administration rushed through a vaccine that turned out to have dangerous side effects. So some 500 Americans experienced serious complications from that vaccine. 25 died as a result, and not a single person who, except those who came into direct contact with pigs, actually died from the swine flu. So that's a cautionary tale. More generally, I think the conclusion reached by many scholars of foreign policy is that policymakers often utilize analogies poorly. They fail to check them for fitness to the circumstances at hand. They're over-influenced by searing analogies that are seared into our collective consciousness, but may not be representative of current events. They rarely consider a portfolio of analogies and sift through them to figure out what fits. So here actually the Cuban Missile Crisis is a counterexample, probably because JFK had a PhD historian, Arthur Schlesinger, in his kitchen cabinet to advise him on what alternative analogies to consider. So it's the role of the economic historian to caution against superficial analogies and parallels, to misquote Mark Twain, who allegedly, but didn't actually say, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Every crisis is different in its particulars. I would argue that historical analogies are useful mainly for pointing to what differentiates current circumstances from their predecessors. So with that lengthy preamble, I'm now going to offer some reflections on the historical episodes about which everyone has been asking: the Spanish flu pandemic, the Great Depression, and the aftermath of World War II, and you can judge for yourself whether I adequately take the preceding to heart. Everybody by now knows the broad details of the Spanish flu pandemic, the most severe pandemic of modern times. Some 500 million people, a third of the world's population, were infected. Some 50 million people died. So those are figures from the website of the US Centers for Disease Control. They imply a mortality rate of 10%, which is a first order difference from what we're seeing now, or at least so one hopes. So far, deaths are on the order of 3 to 5% of confirmed cases, and we know that we're vastly undercounting cases. Mortality rates may go up now as the virus moves to low-income countries, moreover. And another interesting observation is that mortality rates in 1918, 1919 were highest among young people, exactly the opposite of today. In the US, the Spanish flu killed 675,000 people, about 0.6 of 1% of the population. So the comparable figure for the US today would be 2 million deaths from COVID-19. Currently, we're debating whether the death toll in the US will be 60,000 or 100,000 or 140,000. Those numbers are horrific by any standard, but they pale in comparison to what happened in 1918, 1919. The difference plausibly reflects many factors. There was no vaccine. There were no antibiotics. There were no ventilators. There were none of the miracle drugs touted by President Trump. There was less access to clean water. There were less urbanized populations than now. That last fact, I think, helps to explain another one of the dramatic contrasts between then and now. The Spanish flu in the US disproportionately infected and killed white Americans, whereas COVID-19 is disproportionately hitting Blacks and Latinos. The explanation is that over 90% of the urban population in 1910 was white. Now the opposite is true. A greater share of the non-white population is urban compared to the white population. There was also relatively little social distancing. So this brings me to the first point I want to highlight. Clearly, the 1918-1919 pandemic was a major economic event. Studies which have been done about it show that it had a significant long-term impact in the United States and other countries like Sweden, where it's also been studied, on real wages and per capita incomes. It negatively affected the lifetime economic outcomes of individuals who were in utero during the pandemic. But it barely registered, I exaggerate slightly, but only slightly, in the macroeconomic statistics. You can see that, if I can make my slides go, see if I can. Yeah, you can see from this now well-known figure comparing mortality in 1918 in Philadelphia and St. Louis, that the extent of lockdowns and social distancing varied across cities. And that those policies had major impacts on the curve, on mortality rates. But you don't see those kind of impacts in macroeconomic statistics. So the Myron-Romer monthly industrial production index shows its regular seasonal fluctuations in 1918, not unlike 1917 or 1919, 1920. The NBER, seasonally adjusted series for industrial production, trends smoothly upward, just like it did in subsequent years. Freight car loadings show exactly the same seasonal pattern and almost exactly the same level as in 1919, 1920, and 1921. The NBER, which started dating business cycles around this time, did place a business cycle peak in August 1918 and a subsequent trough in March of 1919. The NBER and Burns and Mitchell, on who they relied, looked at a hodgepodge of 40 series on production and business activity and so forth. So far as I can tell, they based their recession call in, they called a, quote, short and mild 1918-1919 recession on the basis of coal production and the output of the textile, stone, lumber, and leather industries, steel, motor vehicles, machinery, petroleum, chemicals, and importantly, agriculture, the leading sectors of the day, seem to have been largely unaffected. The other place you might look for evidence about the macroeconomic effects in the United States is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which began publishing data on employment monthly, again, almost exactly in this period. So I think we see here the impetus that events like this give to the provision of real-time data. The BLS employment index trends downward modestly and smoothly over the course of 1918 by a cumulative 3 or 4 or 5%, depending on the precise months you compare. It then drops by 10% between January and February of 1919 before mounting a V-shaped recovery. That timing is not quite right for this fluctuation to be explained by the pandemic. The first 2 waves were well before that. The third wave was well after. And it turns out that this Bureau of Labor Statistics employment series is for industry alone. No agricultural employment, no mining, no service sector employment. And it's made up heavily of textiles, apparel, boots, and shoes, the same sectors that Burns and Mitchell's recession call weight so heavily. The other important thing that happened in February of 1919 when employment drops is a 5-day general strike by 65,000 workers in Seattle protesting wartime wage controls, a forgotten strike that federal troops were ultimately called out to put down. So I regard the behavior of output and employment in that earlier pandemic as something of a mystery that deserves further study. So I had a conversation about this earlier in the week with one of the authors of the Myron Romer Industrial Production Index, and Christy expressed some of the same uncertainty that I feel. It's not all federal government spending. The war ended in early 1918 and federal government spending was already beginning to ramp down. It could be that the fact I alluded to before, that the country was less urban, the economy was less urban, is part of the story. That we were less globalized than now may be part of the story as well. But I regard this as an important mystery that would reward further study. My second horseman, if you will, is the Great Depression. And I mentioned before how frequently these days economic historians are asked how similar is the 1930s crisis to the economic situation today. I've been getting the question more frequently of late because on Tuesday, in releasing the World Economic Outlook, the IMF wrote that the only close comparison with what we're going through now is the Great Depression of the 1930s. So I think the IMF is right to flag the fact that unemployment in a number of countries is poised to scale 1930s levels. The IMF is right to point to the fact that this is the first true global crisis since the crisis of the 1930s. Even the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 had first order effects only in certain parts of the world. significant emerging markets skated through that event largely unscathed. But there are important differences there between that event and today as well. One difference is the speed with which the downturn unfolded. What it took them the better part of 4 years to accomplish an unemployment rate that rose to 25% in the United States, we seem poised to accomplish in more like 4 weeks. The Great Depression was an event that started in the financial sector and went on to infect the real economy. Now we're beginning to experience the opposite, a real side shock that will eventually affect the financial sector. Another very important contrast is this time central banks are on the case where they were missing in action in the early 1930s.
Barry, I think that there's a problem with your PowerPoint. I don't know if it seems to get stuck. Are you?
It is stuck there. I'll be advancing it more quickly.
No,
Don't
no,
despair.
I just, people are wondering all over the world.
All right. Tell people all over the world to be patient. We'll get there in a moment. From too few slides, I'm about to give you too many.
Yeah.
The best book about the Great Depression, of course, is Charles Kindleberger's The World in Depression, 1929, 1939. Kindleberger made 2 key points about the Depression. First, financial distress was aggravated, and fiscal space was limited in a number of countries by weak commodity prices, which fatally destabilized the situation in a number of developing countries. Secondly, the Depression was greatly aggravated by lack of US economic leadership. And I think both points obviously are timely. A final difference between the 1930s and now is the fiscal policy response. It was tentative at best in the 1930s. It's more aggressive now, although how effective, time will tell. We're now likely to see the rapid growth of debt to GDP ratios in coming years with implications for debt sustainability that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Debt ratios also rose rapidly in the 1930s, but for very different reasons. So I've been doing a little work with colleagues on the development of public debts in the 1930s using the standard decomposition that everybody working in this literature uses, where the change in the debt to GDP ratio, shown on the left here, is a function of primary budget surpluses over time. Larger the surplus, the more debt is retired. The interest rate growth rate differential. If growth rates exceed interest rates, that will tend to work down the debt ratio over time. And this last term, the stock flow adjustment, which is a catch-all term for everything else that contributes to the change in the debt ratio, not captured by the first 2 terms. So you can look at this decomposition and the relative importance of the different factors in the 1930s. And what you can see here is that budget deficits contributed nothing, less than nothing actually, negative sign in the first column, to the rise of debt ratios in that decade. If anything, small primary surpluses put downward pressure on those ratios. A few countries ran primary deficits. The United States, for example, with the expansion of public works, ran small primary deficits, but those were offset by primary surpluses elsewhere. In the 1930s, debt ratios rose mainly due to the collapse of output, as captured in this table by the interest rate growth rate differential. Maintaining a balanced budget in recessionary times, the lesson follows, is no virtue. Doing so does nothing to stabilize output It doesn't even stabilize the debt ratio. Finally, part three, let me say a few words about the other analogy people are invoking so widely these days, the aftermath of World War II. World War II was immensely costly in human lives, of course, but also in terms of physical and financial resources. As a share of GDP, its cost was about twice the cost of World War I, as you can see in the two peaks in the solid black line here. The First World War and the Second World War II was more expensive because of its global scope, because of the more costly military technologies that had been developed in the interim. Governments financed about 50% of their wartime expenditures in World War II by issuing debt, just as they had during World War I. The other relevant point is that central banks contributed heavily to that process of debt finance by purchasing government bonds. As you can see in this figure, the pattern is the same as in World War I, but the extent of those bond purchases was greater during World War II. Generally, meaning in the US, in the UK, and in certain other countries, central banks impose ceilings on both short-term and long-term, on the interest rates on both short-term and long-term treasury securities. They engaged in yield curve control, if you will. In the US, starting in 1942, the Fed placed a ceiling of 0.3% on bills and a ceiling on interest rates on 10-year government bonds of 2.5%. And the Fed enforced both of those ceilings for a decade by purchasing bills and bonds, mainly bills in practice, big time. In other words, the Fed kept doing so not only for the duration of the war, but for 6 full years after the war, in the case of bonds, until the famous Fed Treasury Accord of March 1951. As we've been reminded, not only by the Fed, but also by the Bank of England and the ECB, there are essentially no limits on the ability of a central bank to expand its balance sheet. This balance sheet expansion shown in figure 6.2 is pretty impressive. The question is, at what cost? And I think the relevant cost here is that when the central bank attempts to control the interest rate, it gives up its ability to control the price level. In other words, at some point you're apt to run into a problem of inflation if the warranted or shadow interest rate is above the prevailing or pegged interest rate. That's part of the story of what happened after World War II. So this figure for the United States shows you the evolution of the price level in the relevant period. Inflation rose to 6.5% in 1948, 8.5% in 1946, 8.5% in 1947. There was obviously lots of pent-up demand following wartime controls. So there was lots of spending given prevailing low interest rates, and there was a good deal of inflation. What is less often recalled, though, is then that when a central bank pegs the interest rate, it's equally unable to prevent deflation if demand falls short of supply, if the warranted interest rate is below the prevailing pegged rate. And you can see from this figure that deflation was roughly 10%. Let me pause and repeat. Deflation was roughly 10% between the fall of 1948 and the spring of 1949. It was roughly 5% between the fall of 1949 and the spring of 1950. Those are big numbers. They're not something that central banks would tolerate today. They're a reminder of the magnitude of the deflation that we might have experienced had central banks starting in 2008 and again more recently not only pegged interest rates at low levels, but in addition, importantly, launched QE to supplement that interest rate policy. So what was going on in these deflationary periods? It was the 1949 recession. Firms had gotten out ahead of consumer spending. They produced and invested too enthusiastically starting in 1946. They had too many inventories, so they cut back. Fiscal policy was tightened at this time. There were still problems in Europe making for weak US exports. The Marshall Plan was only beginning. This recession was sharp. It was also short because the Korean War and more fiscal spending appeared on the scene. But the important point, the relevant point I'm trying to make is the Fed did nothing to pull the US economy out of that recession. It kept interest rates right where they were. So what was the Fed doing throughout the pre-accord period between the end of the war and 1951? It wasn't as if the Treasury was still running deficits. You can see here that the federal government budget swung back into balance, and depending on the year you look at into modest surplus almost immediately after the war. It's true that maturing bills had to be rolled over, maturing bonds had to be rolled over, and had the Fed abandoned its cap on interest rates, the cost of doing so could have gone up. But that seems like a weak justification, looking back from a distance of 75 years for tolerating double-digit inflation or double-digit deflation. I think the other factor at work here, this is something that Peter Garber and I discovered in a 1992 article on the Treasury Fed Accord, was financial stability concerns. There was much attention to the Fed's holding of Treasury securities, but in fact, the bulk of US government bonds were not held by the Fed, or significant numbers of them were also held by the banking system. And higher interest rates would have put downward pressure on those bond prices. As Peter and I showed, under the counterfactual that interest rates had been doubled relative to their historical values, that would have wiped out the majority of bank capital at a stroke. Over time, banks rebalanced their portfolios so they were less Treasury bond heavy in 1952 than they had been in 1946. It would have been possible to double interest rates and only eliminate about a quarter of bank capital. So it was possible for the Treasury and the Fed to contemplate allowing interest rates to rise without destabilizing the banking and financial system in 1951-52, where that would have been reckless at the least 5-6 years earlier. I think this history suggests that in thinking about how long our central bank's current policies of pegging interest rates will continue, it will be important to look to the banks and to the financial stability consequences more generally of abandoning those pegs. Finally, there is the worry that once the immediate crisis is over, governments will resort to financial repression to work down very heavy inherited debts. So there's lots of reference to this possibility at the moment. Observers point regularly to the 1950s as an example of the use of financial repression policies to keep interest rates down below growth rates as a way of working down inherited debt burdens. I would agree that there is something to the point. Interest rates on government debt were below growth rates for much of the 1950s and 1960s. Banks were still required to hold government bonds to meet their capital requirements in part. There were caps on other interest rates, the deposit rates offered by banks, for example, that subsidized the demand for government bonds. But in addition, I would point to the role of two other factors in the debt consolidation of the post-World War II period. One is rapid growth. Between 1945 and 1975, growth in the advanced countries ran at 5% per annum. These are impressively rapid growth rates in mature economies by any historical standard. This was the so-called golden age of growth, when countries were able to lower the debt to GDP ratio by growing the denominator. In addition, and underappreciated, I would argue, is there was also a significant contribution to debt reduction from persistent primary surpluses. So I show you here the same kind of debt decomposition after World War I and after World War II. It's the bottom row that is relevant for this discussion, where you can see it's not only the growth rate, interest rate differential that worked to reduce inherited debts, interest rates that were low relative to achieved growth rates, but the fact that governments were able to run persistent primary budget surpluses, not all of them every year, but many of them in most years for the better part of 2 decades. So except for select economies like Italy, which has been able to do this since really the late 1990s, this is quite unusual behavior in our mature democracies. Just how they were able to consolidate inherited debts, in part to the extent 40% of their achievement is attributable to persistent primary budget surpluses. Exactly how they were able to do that is something that I think economic historians should analyze looking back. Myself, I'm inclined toward the kind of political economy explanations that people like Pierre Yared offer. Our political systems were less polarized, less fractionalized. There were fewer instances of rapid changes, serial changes in government, the kind of political circumstances that are conducive to deficit spending than now, which to my mind should render us a bit more pessimistic about whether the kind of fiscal consolidation that Robert Rubin is calling for once the pandemic is over, calling for in the New York Times today, is actually something that our economies and political systems will be capable of achieving. So that's what I have to say. I conclude that history does provide a perspective, several perspectives, if you will, for thinking about our current problems, but that history should be handled with care. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you for giving us a lot of food for thought. And of course, these parallels, as you said, are informative, but also, imperfect. So we will come back to that. So the next comments are from Ricardo Reis. Ricardo?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me well, Eric?
Yep.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to offer some comments after Barry's very insightful discussion. I think the spirit of this was, and I chatted with Barry about that yesterday, was less that I would discuss and address his points more in a discussant back and forth, what do I agree, what do I disagree with, but more to try and stimulate the discussion that will follow afterwards. And so let me go and do that in terms of, stimulating discussion relative to what he said. Oh yes, you can see me now. Thank you for the share screen. Very good. With that regard, I want to organize my comments into 2 points in terms of the differences or not, and 2 things that Barry emphasized, which is what will happen to the debt. Barry spent quite a bit of time on the debt. Why did it go up? Will it go down? How will it go down? And 2, he emphasized a little less, although more in the beginning of his talk, which is what will happen to inflation. And that was a part both because it affected the debt as well as what we will expect to happen or not. Starting with the debt. Starting with the public debt. First point. For the last few years, it has become relatively, let's say, common in economic policy discussions to say that the public debt does not matter. You can pay for it, you can raise it much more, R minus G is low, we've had American Economic Association presidential addresses, we've had even the IMF and many others saying, look, run deficits, it's fine to have large debt, you can have more debt. Let me leave with you the following observation. A week ago, and so with how fast these things go, it's already outdated, I ran a simple regression of, on the left-hand side, how big was the fiscal response adopted by a country, as announced, and again, my data is now 10 days old, on two variables on the right-hand side. How bad the COVID health implications have been in terms of just the number of casualties we've had, and what was the debt to GDP of the country last year, at the end of the year. I'm perhaps sad to report to you that countries that have had a worse health crisis are not the ones that have responded more aggressively or have spent more money responding it. Rather, the debt of last year is the overwhelming statistically significant variable and completely kills the other one. Which is to say, countries that achieved this crisis that started last year with high debt, I bear in mind you Greece or Italy or Portugal, since we're here from the view of London, have had relatively small packages for the intensity of their health crisis, whereas countries like Germany and Denmark have had enormous packages of reform and so on. So that does seem to matter. Now, I'm sure many will still counter-argue, well, it shouldn't matter. That just shows how myopic politicians and policymakers are, perhaps. But certainly, at least in terms of outcomes, it seems that behaving fiscally responsible, even doing that shameful thing, as many put it, of austerity over the last 10 years, seems to pay off when you hit a big crisis in terms of how quickly you can respond or not. Second point on public debt. The rise of debt this year, like, as Barry put it, one can split it into how much is the primary surplus and how much is simply the growth term, or the difference between the nominal interest rate and the growth rate. And using the WEO that was just released, the World Economic Outlook from the IMF and their forecast for next year, you can actually do a forecasted decomposition of this. It's a relatively simple exercise to try and look at it. And so I was trying to look at it a little bit this morning as preparing for this decomposition. You get the numbers somewhat like, well, the increase in debt to GDP that we'll observe by the end of this year, beginning of next year, is roughly half due to the deficits that we're running, and roughly half due to essentially the great collapse in forecasted GDP growth rates, that even the low interest rates are not enough to get there. So even if interest rates go to zero and central bank keep them at zero, we're forecasting falls in GDP at the order of 5 to 8%, depending on different countries, according to the WEO. Now, so far, that's fine, and that in some ways matches some of what Barry said. But here's an interesting, I find, cross-country dimension, which is that the initial debt to GDP ratio, no, I'm not showing slides for the person asked. For the initial debt to GDP ratio, that affects not so much the primary surplus, or not necessarily, but affects big time how much the I minus G term is. And here it is striking to see how even an asymmetric shock in terms of fiscal expenses, or in terms of even just a social shock, has highly asymmetric responses or effects on the public debt. In particular, Greece in the calculation has its debt to GDP growing by as much as 15 to 20%, and it's entirely driven by the fact that it starts with a very high stock of debt. Portugal, having one of the smallest public deficits in response to the crisis, still has the debt increasing from the current 117% to something like 135%. So the asymmetry that will come in terms of the public debt across countries is due to the initial debt starting points, and is going to put a lot of strain both at the world level or not. And this complements, I think, a little bit of what Barry was saying, in that as we compare this also previous crisis, the initial stock of the debt is a very important variable. Finally, thirdly, on the fall of the debt after, like Barry put it, if we look at the example after World War II, primary surpluses account for a rough half of how it was paid, approximately, I'm being a little rough here, and the I minus G term, the nominal interest rate minus growth, are another half of it. Now, like Barry put it, part of it was due to the fact that growth was quite high, or I would say warmly and positively high during those 20 years from 30 years from 1945 to the early 1970s. But as he also put it, a big part of how it was not just the fact that the growth rate was high, but that the interest rates were so low during this period. That is, it was a word that has been used for this is financial repression. What is remarkable in some ways between 1945 and 1975 is how interest rates were low and much lower than the growth rate. So much so that, let me link to the audience, other debates that you have seen, for instance, for those of you who have seen recent arguments the last few years on how, again, debt doesn't matter much because often interest rates are lower than growth rates. Well, those 30, 40 years are a huge part of the samples when you see that. When Thomas Piketty wrote a book a few years ago on inequality and noted how, well, inequality fell and then rose, what variable was low in 1940 to 1970? What variable was higher afterwards? Again, we get back a little bit to these interest rates minus growth differentials. That is, no matter which way you take it, the very low interest rates between 1945 and 1975 are a big part of not just why the debt was paid, but also of why other economic phenomena were observed. Low interest rates therefore seem key. And when we look at how those low interest rates were achieved, like Barry well put it, a lot of it was really indeed very crucial financial repression in the sense of forcing different financial agents to hold government bonds, therefore creating a captive demand through a variety of regulations, through caps and ceilings on how interest could be paid to different constituencies in the population. And as a result, if one was to guess or guesstimate, I guess maybe more accurate, following what Barry said, if the very large debt that has been accumulated is going to be paid similar to World War II, what is perhaps a not too bad guess, I wouldn't go as far as calling it a good guess, is precisely as he said, well, one could just imagine we're going to grow a lot the next 20 years, it'll be fine. But insofar as no economists come up with a magic wand to predict growth, that doesn't seem like a great policy advice, at least. But what I think the reading of economic history, and I want to highlight what Barry said because he mentioned the US, but this is also true when one looks at other countries. When one sees great falls in public debt, and I've done my own research on this topic, it is remarkable how the constant is not to have had high growth. The US had high growth in those 30 years, that worked well. What seems to me, what strikes me as being the common factor is to have financial repression, i.e. unusually low interest rates through not just central banks, because we're talking here, you have to affect real, not just nominal interest rates, but especially through a series of financial regulations, forcing banks to hold, and other financial institutions to hold large amounts of the public debt than others. Even if only because, by the way, financial repression itself not just generates its own revenues, but also gives you the ability to inflate away the nominal liabilities that you force agents to hold. So that's on that, some more food for thought relative to what Barry said. Let me turn to my second point or second comment on inflation. Now, inflation, in the short run, let me start from the current events and a little bit of the way I perceive it to then link it to Barry's discussion in history. In the short run, by which I mean short run the next month or two, the CPI is going to be approximately uninformative about what's going on with inflation. Not only is the basket representative, but more importantly, relative prices are going to dominate everything. And thus the signal from the change unit of account, the pure inflation, if you want, that allows us to understand what will happen to inflation over the next year, 2 or 5 years, is going to completely swamped by the relative price noise. And so I promised myself not to look at the CPI numbers in the next 2 months. They may come out scary, but I think they're not very informative in some way. After the lockdown, though, and that is a period that can happen as quickly as a month, 3 months, 6 months, it is very hard to forecast what exactly will happen to inflation coming out. I mean, we surely see many bottlenecks, both on supply and demand. And so again, we're going to have some very big relative price changes. But even if we were to filter out the relative price changes affecting headline CPI and try to measure against the measure of pure inflation, we're going to have, it's hard to guess whether monetary policy, by keeping interest rates very low, is going to feed into, like Barry said, or insofar more than very low, by keeping interest rates essentially pegged during this period, which is I'm very certain that interest rates are going to be very pegged for the next 12 to 24 months. It's like Barry said, we can either have inflation or deflation. We're essentially going to have bad monetary policy in the sense of pegged interest rates, just as we had after World War II. And by bad, I simply mean bad from an inflation perspective. But exactly the monetary policy that we see in history always whenever we have big debts coming out of wars and other events. And so it's very hard to guess, I think, where inflation is. But let me add two more parts that make it hard to guess this. The first one is, what will be people's expectations? Always an important driver of inflation. And people's expectations will surely change. And what we know is that the experience of what they're experiencing now often scars people, meaning they remember it for a while, as well as that a few goods become very representative. And as a result, it is possible that we could have very quickly expectations becoming severely unanchored, even with little ability for the central bank to do it. But on that note, and now truly more provocative if you want, imagine a world, or not a world, imagine a United States in which President Trump has been reelected, faces an inflation that has shot up because of bottlenecks, say, on the supply side for a few months. And in particular, there are some cues, and due to relative price changes, we have some cues in some particularly essential goods. Boy, and Barry can tell me more since he's a infinitely superior story than I. That reminds me a lot of Nixon in the 1970s and the introduction of price controls, even in the great market economy of the United States. And so let's see what happens to inflation then. And as Barry was putting it, and this, I was reminded as Barry was showing the 1940s, because as he knows very well, that the one factor he didn't mention that kept inflation controlled during that time when interest rates were pegged was, again, the use of a lot of price controls and others. And so I do wonder what that will be. And I would love to hear Barry's perspective as well as the one from the audience. But finally, to conclude in my last, I think, 3 minutes, looking instead to the long run of inflation, what will happen to inflation then after these 12, 24 months? First, insofar as indeed the debt becomes the priority and interest rates are pegged for a long period of time, we have what I call non-inflation monetary policy, but a monetary policy focused on the debt. Then, like Barry said, we could have inflation going up, going down. Essentially, we may end up with unanchored expectations and unanchored inflation. And I would just note that this is not so weird. It is normal after wars, and it is normal after big increase in public spending, that the priority of the central bank is indeed to keep pegs on interest rates, to keep financial repression, to keep the government debt rolling over. I mean, some of us, perhaps because of, again, the lack of economic history, think that the last 30 years of independent central banks and inflation targets is the norm. That is not the norm. Whenever we have very large public spending and very large public debt coming out of large shocks, the norm is that the central bank becomes, to a very large extent, a debt management office and a management of interest rates. And then inflation may go up, may go down. And I think history has many lessons of that, which I wanted to add, which I think is complementary to what Barry was saying. But 2 more points on the long run. One thing that history also teaches us very much when it comes to inflation is that when the central bank is forced to generate revenues, by which I mean real resources, we end up with runaway inflation. Now, this happens sometimes as we teach our students of economics, when the central bank is told by the Ministry of Finance, you shall now print currency so as to generate resources to pay the bills of the army or of the state. And that is the classic lesson of how we teach students how hyperinflation starts, going back to the classic work of Phil Kagan and many, many others. But more generally, I think the general theorem that comes from economic theory is whether it's because the Treasury told it to, or it's because the central bank has to generate revenues to offset losses that it made, we end up with runaway inflation. And what we see right now in the United States is that the Fed has taken an enormous amount of risk in its balance sheet, as much as in 2008 or 9, or perhaps actually, not, I wouldn't say as much, more than it has. And so the big question is, if in the next few years, the Fed makes losses, which is perfectly plausible, especially some of the corporate bond purchase programs will potentially lead to losses. Will we see the fiscal backing from the Treasury that permits it to not have to generate resources, the central bank itself, or will we not? And that the answer from the very recent history, 2010, 2013, was that the Fed got basically lucky in many ways. The risk it took led to very large gains for the most part. This risk didn't materialize. But the next 3-4 years, I think that's going to be a very big question. And finally, thirdly, and again, to finish my inflation comments provocatively, much as I finished the debt ones, the third determinant of whether inflation goes out of hand, I first mentioned 1, if you're pegging interest rates, 2, if you need to generate revenue, central bank. But a third one has tended to be a central bank that is not independent. Central bank independence seems to have significantly contributed a little bit all over the world to lower inflation expectations. Let me say something provocative, but it's not, but which I think is not, well, I won't say it's 100, I'm 100% going to claim it and die on the stake on it, but I think it's pretty close to being true. The Federal Reserve is not an independent central bank right now. The law that passed Congress a week ago said that when it comes to the corporate bond purchase program that the Fed is following, not only did Congress put constraints on what lending of last resort through this program can the Fed do, but moreover, it gave the Treasury Secretary discretion on telling the Fed exactly which categories of corporate bonds to do or not. This is as close as it gets to not having an independent central bank. The Treasury Secretary can dictate to Jay Powell how the funds of corporate bond purchases, who should get them, who should not, according to criteria partly defined by Congress, but allowing much discretion to the Treasury. Now, maybe that's a very temporary thing. Maybe the Treasury Secretary will not exert this power. And maybe in the same way that Dodd-Frank kind of cleaned the house very quickly after the Great Recession in terms of relaying the boundaries between Treasury and the Fed, maybe likewise we'll have that in the next 6 months and independence will be restored. But this time, much more in 2009, the independence through the act of 2 weeks ago has clearly been taken away in some regard, in many regards. And so I wonder whether, and this to end with linking again back to Barry, I think one forecast that history may help us make is that I think we'll have a new Treasury Fed accord. Will it take the 10 years with a 10% deflation followed by 7% inflation that Barry described in 1946 or 47, 48 before he got 51? Or will it take 6 months and we'll never see it at all? But I think that's certainly something that will happen. And note, by the way, I don't want to say this as saying, oh, what a shame we lost interbank independence. Again, in situations of emergency, it may make perfect sense for the central bank stopping independent, and it probably made perfect sense in the last few months. But I think we will need the help not just of economic historians, as well as the political scientists and others, to understand what's the new political equilibrium. The story of the Treasury Fed Accord, as Barry knows, because and some of what I know about it, I learned from reading his books and articles, is just a fascinating period in economic history and policy making of how exactly it was established. And I think some of it will come back and we will have much to learn from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you for those provocative and insightful comments. So we're going to open it up for questions in a minute, but I wanted to give Barry the chance to maybe make some additional comments to Ricardo's. Also, there was a question from actually Facebook Live. We have this running on Facebook as well. So is fiscal consolidation the same as austerity measures? Maybe you could elucidate people what you mean by fiscal consolidation. Barry.
By fiscal consolidation, I mean successfully reducing the debt to GDP ratio. And that can be done through a number of mechanisms by running primary budget surpluses. Large primary budget surpluses are informally referred to as austerity, but you can also consolidate your debt in the sense of bringing down your debt to GDP ratio by growing the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio through the different mechanisms that we described. So they're not exactly the same. Ricardo, thank you for the comments. Viewers will think that this was a carefully choreographed pair of presentations that complemented one another perfectly. So the complemented one another part is true. The carefully choreographed is not. So kudos for anticipating what I was going to say and or making it up on the spot. Couple of points in response. I do think that the prospects for successful debt consolidation this time will turn on what happens to the interest rate growth rate differential that we've all been discussing. I'm strongly of the view at the moment that this searing event is going to change economic behavior, just like the Great Depression changed savings and investment behavior. A lot of households realize they had not been engaging in enough precautionary savings. And they're going to do that once events begin to normalize. And I think firms are going to be cautious about large fixed investment projects until they're convinced that the virus will not be back and they know more about the post-COVID economic landscape. So if private spending is going to be subdued, interest rates are going to remain low for the same reason secular stagnationists were arguing in favor of, were explaining low interest rates before the crisis. The question is what happens to growth? So those same factors will work to depress the growth rate, other things equal. And the question is whether government can step in where private spending is no longer adequate without blowing out the debt ratio. Central banks and inflation. So Eric and I were on a call earlier with two central bankers, a prominent European central banker and a prominent US central banker. And if I'm correct, we did an hour and a half where they didn't mention inflation once. So it's remarkable how the focus of central banks has turned on a dime, appropriately under the circumstances, in my view. Just as in the 1940s, the priority was the maintenance of financial stability. Today, the priority should be the maintenance of financial stability once again. Finally, on price controls, I do think we will see capital controls becoming widespread in coming months. Price controls are a different story. I think we will see price controls only where there are serious shortages of basic commodities, where food and fuel is not available because supply chains have broken down, or because governments can't get money and or goods into the hands of people unfortunate enough to live in favelas. So I don't see price controls as a likely response in the advanced economies, but I do think we are likely to see them in a number of developing countries and emerging markets.
Can there's a few questions coming over the chat room, but I'll use the prerogative of the chair. So, one thing that we very much are concerned about now is, of course, the ability of the sort of global economy or to stimulate, or the possibilities of individual countries to contribute to a stimulus that in the same way as in the global financial crisis. And if you take what Ricardo was saying about what he has seen from the level of debt in some countries, how that affects their capacity, or at least the willingness to respond to the COVID epidemic. If we look at the global debt levels now, and maybe looking historically, what are the possibilities of getting something similar to what we saw in 2008, 2009, in terms of a global stimulus? And I guess it's a lot about China, but it's what are the possibilities there? Maybe both of you.
Well, I think countries vary enormously in their fiscal space, both because of the inherited debts that Ricardo emphasized, and because of the presence or absence of a central bank that can backstop that debt market, because the debt is issued in local currency. So emerging markets often have foreign currency denominated debt, and if it isn't foreign currency denominated debt of the government, it's foreign currency denominated debt of the corporate sector, which in this crisis is exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. So it all depends on who you ask and who you're talking about. And I think the fact that no new SDR allocation came out of the G20 and IMF World Bank meetings bodes ill for those prospects.
Ricardo, did you have any comment to that or not?
Well, I would add just two small things. First, that the note that in the short run, and again, this is good economic policy as well as common when one looks at economic history. In the short run, the very large expenses that we needed were essentially financed by the central bank, as should be. There's just no way in which a government can issue the amount of debt as quickly as we need to do fiscal expenses. And so the central bank does the right thing and stands behind fast stability. Now, what matters then, though, is going forward, though, what the central banks have done is that they have not printed currency. What they have done is that the government issues the debt it wants and the central bank buys them while issuing reserves, that is, creating debts from the banking sector to itself, deposit the bank to the central bank itself. Now, as the governments pay off this debt, as Barry was saying, hopefully through maintenance of low interest rates, high growth, the governments pay the central bank. The central bank is able to retire the reserves, that is, these credits that it created from society onto itself. And then we are perfect. And this does not need to generate inflation or a financial crisis of any type. But note that, and that is important to note, the central banks, all they did was to support this. All the central banks did was to provide liquidity, if you want. The central banks didn't generate the resources used for the fiscal stimulus now. That is, there's still going to be, taxes are going to have to be collected or not to pay this debt, or if not taxes, then again, benefiting from growth dynamics and interest rate dynamics. So I'd like to note that the central bank, again, is providing, if you want, bridges, but it's not paying for things. And so as a result, we will see. And I said that, and if the central bank is made to pay because the government defaults on the debts that it has contracted with the central banks now, then that's a sure remedy to have inflation and so on. Second, Eric, I would note when you say, will we see a large stimulus coming soon? Like Barry, I'm somewhat pessimistic because the debt was already very high to start with. But I will also note that it's not obvious, that is for me, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, that we're going to need huge amount of fiscal spending in 2021, yes or not. We need a huge amounts now, both for social insurance reasons, as well as to try to offset the loss of revenue and try not to destroy the productive capacity. But it's unclear that for instance, next year, again, if one looks at the WIO, this year has an 8% fall in GDP in many countries, and next year a 6% increase in GDP. Now, this goes back to this discussion of V, W, L, or U. I don't know which one it is, but the figure I have in my mind is you're going to have a sharp drop this year. You're going to have a sharp increase next year that doesn't for sure hit the full 100% recovery. Is it going to be more like a 50%, more like a 30, or more like 70% of what was lost now? That is what I don't know. But for sure, there's going to be a big increase next year. Will extra fiscal spending in those circumstances, in an economy that is growing fast but recovering from a big hole, does that help or hinder? Is it necessary or not? That I think is much less obvious, by the way, when we talk about the needs for fiscal spending in recessions. It is not for the kind of economy we're going to see in 2021.
And I just note the numbers from China came this morning, and it seems like the big problem in China is actually the lack of demand, and particularly foreign demand going away. So, but anyhow, Waltrud, are you on still? Waltrud, or you want me to? So Waltrud asked two questions, which was very much related to our previous conversation, and inflation is not only central bank money, but also a mechanism like rising prices and wages to sustain it. Otherwise, it will. Okay, Walter, here.
I thought you can read it out, but I just wanted to say the first is inflation needs not only central banks, it needs also a mechanism by which wage earners and firms can rise wages and prices, right? That we don't see at the moment. And was a problem before the crisis. Otherwise, all this central bank money will just lead to more asset price inflation. And I wonder whether that's a solution to anything. It may just be more of the same. And secondly, a question more to Ricardo. Why should a central bank care about its losses at all? I mean, isn't it perhaps a way of writing off some of the sovereign debt and let central banks stand with their negative equity? in the absence of a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, I think this could be perhaps one of the solutions.
You want to go?
So I'm happy to leave the central bank profitability issue to Ricardo. On inflation, I do very much agree that you not only need credit creation, but credit utilization in order for inflation to result. Because I think there will be precautionary savings, I think that that spending will be subdued. That's why my expectation going forward is low interest rates with, at best, low inflation rates going alongside.
Good. And for me, I mean, the central bank losses. So if one has to distinguish here economics from accounting. So accounting negative equity for a central bank is, for all matters, irrelevant in some ways. In some ways, even applying standard corporate accounting to a central bank is itself weird, since its liabilities and its assets are not really very well defined in the way they are to a corporation. However, what is very well defined to a central bank, as well as to any other economic agent, is a resource constraint. And that resource constraint, in real terms, says the central bank produces some resource stream and distributes it as a dividend or not to the fiscal authority, if you want. So in the case of the central bank, the only resource stream that the central bank produces comes from printing pieces of paper called currency that people are willing to give it real goods in return. That is what's usually known as seigniorage. That is its resource stream. That is the one that it distributes to fiscal authorities. If the central bank suffers losses, that is, if it engages in investments in which it borrows from banks, because that's what the central bank is doing now when it issues reserves. It's borrowing from banks to then invest. And then it wipes out all those investments. Well, the banks who are holding these reserves will want to say, well, can you please switch these reserves for currency? I want to withdraw my reserves from the central bank and convert them into currency. The central bank, being committed to transform the reserves into currency, will have to then print the currency. By print the currency, will generate the resources to indeed pay the banks. But by paying the currency will also generate inflation. So central bank losses, the problem is that if the central bank, as now, does an increase in reserves and buys assets, and then there's no more assets to cover the reserves, when a bank comes in right now, where the assets match the liabilities, the central bank can say, very well, I will sell you, bank, you want to take away some of the reserves out of the central bank, here's a bond back, because I had a government bond in my assets. If there's no bonds there because they've all defaulted, central banks say, well, here's a piece of paper, here's currency, because after all, currency reserves have to exchange one to one. And it's that printing of the currency that then generates the inflation. So that's the sense in which losses matter. That's also the sense in which fiscal backup is important. If the central bank can run with zero assets and many, many debts to the banks, if whenever a bank shows up and says, I would like to exchange my deposit central bank for currency, the central bank says, well, as opposed to exchange for currency, here's instead a piece of paper from the government, or here's a tax revenue that the government gives you because the government has supported me in that fiscal support. And so that's, again, why the accounting of net equity is not useful. But that's why I think the more useful is to what extent the central bank is fiscally backed. And if it has losses and does not have that fiscal backing, then inflation will result from the printing of currency.
We have a question from Shirley E. Shirley, are you there?
Hi, thank you very much. Question for Barry, please. During and post the Great Depression, FDR implemented very Keynesian sort of economics to tackle a demand insufficiency. And so it's arguable that it is Keynes that has not only saved the US from the Great Depression, but also democracy itself. And so as we see now, China has recently tabled a new infrastructure development plan in the amount of trillions of RMB over the next few years. And so that is very much going back to FDR's 1930s. And with the fiscal expansion of $2.2 trillion that's recently signed by the White House, how much of it is actually used for infrastructure expansion? Why the US does not take this crisis as an opportunity to expand its infrastructure programs?
So it's okay. I'm going to collect a few questions because they're lining up now. Can I have Creon Butler?
Thanks very much, Eric. I just wanted to pick up on the question about a post-epidemic stimulus. So if a stimulus is needed, I mean, how should it be designed, given that the continuing factors, I think Barry highlighted, that's depressing demand may well be fear of the epidemic coming back or of it still being there, and that the priority will be to not to kind of repair bank capital, but to repair all the damage that's been done in the SME sector and maybe in the services sector. So if it is a stimulus, it's a very unique type of stimulus. I wonder if either Barry or Ricardo could say something about how we should design it.
And Jens Landsgaard.
Thank you. Gentlemen, this is Friday afternoon, and we are having an enthusiastic discussion about economics. But keep in mind, that's workaholics like us. If you go out there in the street and ask people, what do you take from this crisis? They'll be saying something like, oh, it's actually quite nice. We're slowing a bit down, and maybe we should learn that we should aim for some kind of low growth scenario and low growth society going forward. That's not quite what people would have said in the late 40s. So, I mean, do you seriously think, Barry in particular, can we really take something from a time where people were longing for more material riches and transfer the lessons from then about the growth to interest differential and take it up until today? I might think that we should be cautious, but on the other hand, of course, the many more pension savers today might mean that we can do the trick with lower growth, but also with lower interest rates. What are your thoughts?
Jens, I think there are some people who are also experiencing hardship now, but we will come to that. And of course, what's happening in the rest of the world now is a bit different from what you just described. But I think it still is a relevant question. What are the limits of historical parallels here? Barry, you had 3 questions.
So the first couple of questions were about infrastructure spending and post-crisis fiscal stimulus. It's important to recognize that outside of China, we're still in the first month of the COVID-19 crisis. And every single dollar that has been appropriated by the Congress has gone into income maintenance for people who need it, for loans to small businesses and big businesses, and grants that businesses that need to stay afloat. And it's premature to start acting on the post-crisis problem before we know the shape that the post-crisis problem takes. Again, I am sure there will be reflection based on the experience of the 1930s. What did FDR do? He invested heavily in insurance, in social insurance. We got the Social Security Act, note the word, to provide old age pensions. We got unemployment insurance. We got a variety of related programs. And I think this crisis has laid bare the need for that kind of social insurance in countries where, like the United States, where it's not adequately provided. So you can bet during the recovery phase, there will be more spending on healthcare. There will be Medicare for all, where everybody can opt into government financed healthcare. Will there also be a big infrastructure initiative? I think that depends on the shape of the recovery. If it's V-shaped, the answer is no. If the recovery is an extended process, then yes, there will be opportunity to revisit the lessons of the Tennessee Valley Authority from the 1930s and see which ones of those can be transferred to the present. The one place where those two things, insurance and infrastructure, come together, of course, is over climate change. And we're having a debate at the moment about whether this crisis will distract us all from the climate change problem or reinforce our concern with the climate change problem. I would like to think the answer is the latter. Finally, Jens Lundsgaard, where are you based, Jens? In Scandinavia, I conjecture.
Correct.
When I'm around the Berkeley Hills, I too see people walking their dogs and rethinking their lifestyles. But I think Eric is right that the majority reaction is, I need to get a stable job that pays better and will work harder if need be in order to attain that economic security. That will be the reaction of the vast majority of the world's population.
Ricardo?
So yeah, two brief points. The first one is, I'm essentially going to repeat what Barry said during his talk, but I'm going to say it in my words, which is, I think there's an increase in risk and insecurity in the world, now driven by health and in a very visible way. That increase in risk and security leads to an increase in precautionary savings individually. I was just in a BBC program yesterday where there was a personal financial advisor saying, see, you should save. Everyone save more. Learn that from this experience. And this is where John Maynard Keynes will strike with a vengeance in his very big lesson, which is the paradox of thrift. I mean, if all of us come out of this saving, we could end up really in a Great Depression. If we all come out of the saving an extreme amount, even if individually each one of us wants to save, the fact is that the combination of all of us saving could indeed lead to an enormous contraction in aggregate demand, potential deflation, and a very prolonged recovery. I think Barry said this, I'm saying it in slightly different words, but I think that's a very important thing to note. And again, like I said, what I think is in many ways the main lesson, of course, John Maynard Keynes had many, many lessons, but one of his main lessons of the Depression, which is the paradox of thrift, could really hit us with a vengeance. Second point, I have time to draw it. I don't know if this is a V or a U or an L, but the economy fell a lot. It's going to bounce back for sure. I mean, once we reopen the economy and I can go back to work, there's going to be some bounce back. And then it's going to recover slowly. Is that going to be very slow, faster? I don't know. And that's the big question. So I think the discussions on V's and U's, I think we should talk about how steep this is. That's what's uncertain. This is already in the data, and this for sure is going to happen some. And the hard thing is how steep this is going to be. And on that, and going back on these questions on infrastructure and development, to make this steeper or flatter, again, I resisted a little while ago, and I'll double down on that and calling this, we need aggregate demand stimulus, but which is not to say we don't need necessarily fiscal stimulus. A lot of the duration of this, as Jens and the others were pointing, has to do with potential reorganization of the economy. It seems to me perfectly plausible, although I wouldn't go as far as venture to guess it, that we have a contraction in some sectors and expansion in some very large sectors. Perhaps hospitality will fall a lot, whereas the healthcare sector rises. Perhaps deliveries will become much more important, so transportation will rise a lot, as opposed to, I don't know, sporting events will fall or other things that involve crowds. All of these restructuring organizations of economies are always painful. They always lead to flatter versions of this. And what I just told you is a supply story, if you want, just from pure organization. In all of these, to complement, by the way, the demand story, in all of these, sometimes targeted, well thought out fiscal spending or government intervention can make things much better. It can also make things much worse, but it can make things much better. And therefore, would I call that infrastructure spending? I'm not sure, but at the same time, yes, maybe. Maybe indeed this is the shock that leads to people caring more about climate. We do need to have a climate transition. And as we have a big shift in industries toward cleaner at the demand of customers and society, then we end up indeed needing a new set of infrastructure associated with a climate economy. That seems to me a possibility, one of those that requires government spending and maybe infrastructure. But I think it's more important to think that both on demand because of the paradox of thrift and on supply because of reorganization, those are the things that could lead to great changes and where governments have to be very alert, yeah.
Can we, Jean Frieda, are you there?
Hi there. Yeah, so Barry, I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on your comments about capital controls, because I think it's one thing, that I've thought a lot about. How do you untangle such a complex financial system? That seems to be one of the material differences between where we are today and any other historical analog. And it's very difficult, for me at least, to think of financial repression, working in a cleaner fashion. If you go down that road, it seems like it would be associated with a very high cost in terms of achieving some net positive end goal. So any thoughts on, number one, how that might develop, and number two, are you envisioning this as more of a emerging markets problem, or is this more of a generalized reversal in, capital account liberalization?
Hi, Gene. I'm viewing it as an emerging markets problem. So the United States, when it followed regulatory policies designed to keep interest rates down in the 1950s and 1960s, did not resort to capital controls. Yes, there was the interest equalization tax in the 1960s and this and that, but basically an open capital account because we didn't have the kind of economic weakness and financial problems that make for capital flight. That's the emerging market situation. At the moment, we're currently poised to pour official money into emerging markets, and I think there will be concern about that official money leaking right back out in the form of capital flight or to pay off foreign creditors. There will have to be debt restructuring in select emerging markets, where select may be an umbrella term for a large number of different countries. And restructuring debts without limiting the flight out of other financial assets is going to be hard. So I think emerging markets and developing countries are going to have to resort to controls.
So I'm going to collect a few questions here because we are running out of time. So there's a question from Facebook which kind of relates to this, which it says from Santiago Mosquera. It says, in your view, do you think the global economy would tighten in terms of trade? And in that case, how would that affect growth rates? I mean, I guess it ties it somewhat into the issue of capital controls as well. Vicky Price, you have the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, you can hear me?
Yep.
Right, so for Ricardo, really, the issue of debt and how countries which are quite indebted have tended not to spend an awful lot of extra money now for this crisis. But of course, there is a European dimension, the Eurozone. Obviously, there are countries like Greece and Italy and others who have a bit of a problem there in terms of spending a lot more. Whereas if you look at places like Japan, where I think the fiscal stimulus is something like 10% of GDP, and if you look at the US, of course, as well, and China. So I'm not convinced that the debt to GDP ratio itself, if you look outside the Eurozone of the previous year, is necessarily a contributing factor to how much is being spent right now. And then, one other very small thing in relation to, why we might end up and climate change or everything else, and whether there will be the right spending in those areas. We've already had the European Commission announce just today, at least it was in the papers today, that they're abandoning some of the targets that they had in terms of spending priorities and priorities generally on climate change in relation to the new Green Deal. So we seem to be stepping back on that, but it does suggest to me, if you look at the debt situation, what may happen in the future, particularly if we have a W-shaped recovery with the whole problem of the virus may be re-emerging and few lockdowns and no investment, that it is going to be the public sector that's going to have to sustain the economy. And therefore, particularly thinking about what Barry's been saying, the debt situation will likely get worse for a considerable number of years before it starts getting better as a ratio to GDP. And I wonder how an extended worsening might be responded to, apart from, for example, continuing central bank financing. Thank you.
Maybe Piroska, can you relate to the previous discussion as well? She's no. Piroska had a question about.
Yes, sorry. Yes, no, sorry. I had to unmute myself, of course. So the question relates to what is really new in this new setting, and one new thing is, of course, the massive use, very innovative use also of currency swaps. Since both of you are experts on this, so what do you think about the currency swaps of the Fed, which really has gone beyond what they did in 2009 and alike, and now offering this special repo also for a string of foreign financial monetary authorities? which is I mean, it's not a swap, but it's a major step, a repo. Even this ECB, as we heard this afternoon, decided to give currency swaps to Croatia and Bulgaria. So they are growing up also as kind of the regional central bank. So how you see this type of instrument, as how powerful this is to hedge against emerging market pressures and potential crisis?
Okay, I think I had to draw a line there. So both of you. Barry, you want to start?
Sure. Prospects for trade, not good. I think there will be political pressures. Nationalism is rearing its head. Arguments for national self-sufficiency in the production of PPE are going to be heard, and economically firms are going to be shortening their supply chains. I think the argument for growing trade remains intact, only trade that is growing more slowly than before. The EU putting its climate goals or climate-related spending on hold. I'm a strong believer in climate change mitigation measures, but I also would argue we all need to make sacrifices in this crisis. And I think climate change mitigation has to be a problem for 2021 if all goes well, not for 2020. Finally, on central bank swaps and Fed repos, I wouldn't want to neglect the Treasury repo program, which provides dollar credit to central banks that are holding US dollar reserves on a short-term basis. Great for bringing down the cross-currency basis and avoiding interruptions to the provision of trade credit. But this does nothing for countries with solvency problems. And unfortunately, now there are a lot of emerging markets with solvency problems.
Can I go back, Eric? Yep. Okay, so, and myself, I mean, just very briefly on Vicky, I mean, I think I agree with everything you said in some ways, meaning, so well, let me pick on first on I report to you the result for regression. You said, what if you take out all of Europe? Well, if I take out all of the European countries, I end up, as usually in the regression, if you start taking out observations, at some point you don't have that many. And the health crisis hasn't really spread in a significant way to all the many countries. But it may be the case. It may be the case that once we collect more data, Vicky, you're completely right. And the qualified right statement is countries that had a lot of debt to start with and did not have a national central bank are the ones who then didn't have the funds to respond. If that's the case, I think that's completely consistent with everything that I said and that would be fine. On whether if it's W and as a result, we need more of more central bank intervention. I think again that's that's entirely consistent, or I agree with the things that Barry and myself said, which is again this is whether it's because the debt is very high now, and again we're going to end up having to have some financial repression, a central bank with a very bloated balance sheet that comes down only slowly, keeping interest rates low and transitions out of it. Or is it because not just the impact now, but on top of it, there's a further increase in the debt next year and 2 years from now? I think ultimately the problems and issues that arise are exactly the same. I.e., ultimately we're gonna have to pay for this debt through either taxes, primary surpluses, or through interest rate growth combinations. And two, the central bank can perfectly well have a large balance sheet as long as it doesn't make losses in the sense that I precisely defined 20 minutes ago, as long as it keeps fiscal backing in that sense. And as a result, doesn't have to print currency as opposed to having a large balance sheet in order to get out of those. And then finally, thirdly, on the question on the central bank swap lines that Piotr raised, let me I think I'm going to repeat Barry a little bit here, but just, I mean, the central bank swap lines are extremely useful to prevent fire sales. That's what they're there for. They're a lender of last resort policy that's extremely effective. I recently published a paper just a few days ago showing how this time they were extremely effective yet again. The impact on the cross-currency base and the CFP deviations is really quite extreme, and you see it right away. And the expansion to other jurisdictions showed it as well. And so they're good to prevent fire sales. But that's what they do. I mean, they prevent fire sales and prevent huge market disruptions. they don't change ultimate solvency. I mean, they're like a central bank lender of last resort to banks. That's what they do. They do not solve any solvency themselves. And I think the problems of emerging markets right now are not purely liquidity. I mean, it's really quite of a storm of a strong dollar, a contraction in global demand, the health emergency. And so I see a lot of concerns here that have to do with solvency. On the Treasury repo that Barry mentioned, I mean, the Treasury repo, the Fed's repo operation with Treasuries, as of now, it's had very little take-up. And I don't think it's had a very large effect. And the reason is, I think what the Fed has done extremely aggressively, and since you mentioned ECB, is as always, the Fed is extremely aggressive at defending the dominance of the dollar. And the central bank swap lines are extremely important for that, and sustaining low interest rates in the Treasury market. And so 2 weeks ago, and sustaining the low interest rates is again conditional with the things that Barry was teaching us this afternoon about how important is the role of the central bank stepping in this crisis. And what we had 2 weeks ago is that people were selling treasuries to realize liquidity, and they were selling treasuries left and right. And so what did the Fed do? The Fed has been buying treasuries at a daily rate that far exceeds what it ever did, including 2012 and 19, to keep the price of those treasuries up and the long-term interest rates down. And then as it did that, there was a fear of, well, maybe it's instead the foreigners that are selling their treasury reserves, their 10-year bonds, and that's what's pushing the price down. Guess what? Let's tell them, don't sell it. I'll lend you dollars against them just to make sure you don't sell 10-year bonds, and we keep the price of those treasuries high, and we keep the long interest rates down. So that program is less, I think, about cross-currency basis, but it's essentially just entirely treasury support. Why has it had not much of an effect, in my view? Is that I think ultimately it's not that Brazil, China, or well, not so much Brazil, China, and all the other countries with very large treasury reserves were selling them desperately because they needed cash to meet liquidity changes. No, and actually quite on the contrary, they're pretty happy to say a treasury is just as liquid as a dollar in my pocket, so I'm happy to hold my treasuries. I don't need dollars in exchange for the treasuries. I continue to be confident I will sell them. And that is where I conclude on that, is that it was again a successful intervention of the US to keep the treasury market the true safe asset, the dollar the true safe currency, because lo and behold, it was another policy that tells the Chinese, all the countries around the world, you don't need to sell your 10-year treasuries. We're going to keep their prices high in a case like this. We'll even lend people money to them through the central bank not to sell their 10-year treasuries. And lo and behold, it succeeded yet again, even without having to have been triggered. You're muted, Eric.
Sorry. Yeah, so thank you very much. We have reached the time of closure of this. So thank you to you, and thank you to everybody who has been listening in, both here and on Facebook. You know, Barry started with some reflections on, you know, what it means to be an economic historian or a historian, and how you think in terms of looking at crisis situations and learning from them. And I think you have illustrated that beautifully today. And what I said initially about you as a historian willing to engage in very contemporary issues and policy debates also came out very strongly in this. And actually, we also saw that Ricardo is a little bit of a closet historian, which is good to know. But I think there are many reasons going forward to think back to history, because we are going to go through different phases of this crisis. And then Barry was sort of saying in passing that, you know, death rates from COVID-19 will go up as we go in. It moves into developing and emerging economies in a more serious way. And of course, we know, for example, that the Spanish flu was many times more deadly in India, for example, than it was in the US. So, you know, we have a lot of reasons to try to think about what the lessons are from history. So thank you very much. And